Right. Good evening. My name is Dr. Jason Ackerman. I'm a faculty member at in the IUPUI School of Liberal Arts, and I'm the director of the Ray Bradbury Center. What is the Ray Bradbury Center? It is one of the larger single-author archives in the United States. It's also a small museum. We have recreated Ray Bradbury's basement office with entirely original artifacts, and we do offer tours to the public on occasion. So please follow us on social media if you'd ever like to come and see the collection. On behalf of the Bradbury Center and the School of Liberal Arts, I want to welcome you to our literary festival, Festival 451 Indie. We have events throughout the month of September to celebrate our literary heroes. Two of mine are going to be taking the stage in just a moment. To encourage people, the festival encourages people to cultivate an active reading life and to celebrate the humanities. Our festival references Ray Bradbury's most famous work, Fahrenheit 451, a cautionary tale about the consequences of the cultural devaluation of literacy. His words, "You don't have to burn books to destroy a culture, just get people to stop reading," have only become more poignant and relevant today. That's why we felt that a festival like Festival 451 Indie was necessary. So thank you so much for being here tonight and being part of it. Hopefully you picked up some note cards. As you're listening to the speakers tonight, please write down your questions. And I think these two aisles here, if I'm wrong, somebody will correct me. Okay, I got the thumbs up from the boss. So these two aisles here, you'll be able to approach a microphone and address your questions. So please stick around for the Q&A. Sometimes that's the best part, although I think everything about tonight's going to be great. We also want to thank the A.W. Clues Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event and for sponsoring the entire festival that lasts the entire month of September. Their generosity made this festival possible. In your programs tonight, there's a short survey. If you could fill that out and turn it in to one of our team members at our information table in the lobby, that would be super helpful for us. We do have to do a grant report for Clues, and your response to the event tonight would go a long way in helping us craft that report. We definitely appreciate it. Before introducing our speakers, I want to share a brief land acknowledgement. IUPUI acknowledges our location on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people. We honor the heritage of Native peoples, what they teach us about the stewardship of the earth, and their continuing efforts today to protect the planet. Founded in 1969, IUPUI stands on the historic homelands of Native peoples, and more recently, that of a vibrant Black community, also unjustly displaced. Where we sit tonight, Madam Walker Theater, is one of the last vestiges of that vibrant community. As the present stewards of the land, we honor them all as we live, work, and study at IUPUI. Today, people in this state who teach about the injustices of the past are under attack. And I want to affirm tonight that we stand with our public educators, our public libraries, and librarians. We honor their expertise. We will never correct the injustices of the present if we fail to acknowledge our past, especially the parts that make us uncomfortable. If there are educators and librarians in our audience tonight, would you please raise your hand so we can honor you? Thank you. Thank you for what you do. Tonight, in part, we honor Ray Bradbury, a great author who spent his life standing up for public libraries because knowledge should be free and accessible to everyone, no matter what. We stand against any attempt to whitewash our history. The old adage that those who refuse to learn history are doomed to repeat it rings true. But I would add, it seems clear that those who actively try to prevent history from being taught intend to repeat it. We will not let that happen. So tonight, the Ray Bradbury Center is thrilled to partner with our friends at the Center for Africana Studies and Culture in presenting a night with two legendary authors, Dr. Charles Johnson and Stephen Barnes. Tonight's event will be moderated by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Les Etienne, Executive Director of the Center for Africana Studies and Culture. Dr. Les, the stage is yours, my friend.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Little housekeeping before we get started, because we are breathing rarefied air here tonight. So I want to acknowledge, right in the front here, two also legendary writers, Ms. Sharon Skeeter and also Ms. Tana Reeve Dew, right here in the front. And big thanks to Jason and the staff and folks at the Bradbury Center for putting this on and also giving us an opportunity to play a role in it. Some colleagues from liberal arts are sitting right there. Shout out to y'all. Hello. And also our dean. Let me see. Oh, and look, Rob Ryman, our other colleague, but our dean is also in the house here tonight as well. Tammy Idle. So I'd like to bring up Mr. Barnes and Dr. Johnson, if they could hear me, to come on up, and we'll get started. Let's give them a round of applause.
You went to the right?
I'm going to go to the right. Thank you.
All right, welcome. Thank you both for being here. Greatly appreciated.
Pleasure.
I think it's always good to introduce folks to who we have, this august panel that we're in here tonight. So if you wouldn't mind, we just get started, jump right in. But also, I think there might be people in the house that would want to know about who we are sitting with tonight.
Yeah. Oh, I'm always curious about who I'm sitting with, especially when I'm sitting alone in a room.
Exactly. Okay. There we go. So, you know what I forgot to say?
What did you forget to say?
We have Mr. Maurice Broadus in the house tonight as well.
Yay! We walk with giants.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So, if you don't mind, I will start with the youngest of us.
Oh, really?
Yes, Dr. Johnson.
I think you got
Come on, young man.
Okay.
If you don't mind, because I think it's very important for us to understand the value in the work you've done in the literary world, but also in academia and some of these other places. If you don't mind, just giving a brief bio, a little bit about yourself.
Okay. You got 30 minutes?
We got it.
First, I want to say this is a joyful occasion for me to be on the stage with this gentleman, but especially that gentleman on the end. We have collaborated on any number of projects in the past, most recently The Eightfold Path, which is an award-winning, as it turns out, graphic novel. All of it, all the credit goes to Steve. They're all of his stories. Okay, I came on and I took the ride with you, and it was like anything we do together, a great pleasure. We have a lot of overlap. I did a book in 1988 called Being and Race, Black Writing Since 1970. And in the last chapter, it's a survey of Black writers up to 1970. In the last chapter, I mentioned this guy I keep running across. He's a martial artist, and he writes science fiction. And he's a black dude too. I'm thinking, that's me. That's me. But then I realized, no, it's this character over here, Stephen Barnes, who has been my hero for a very long time. My history, my journey into creativity was truly influenced by the man who did this book here, Zen and the Art of Writing, Ray Bradbury. But I come to this from being a journalist and a cartoonist. That was my first love, my first passion was drawing. In high school, I became a professional illustrator when I was 17. I did some illustrations for a Magic Company catalog in Chicago. And I saved that dollar, by the way, too, that I got paid. It's framed. And there were times I was going to use it because I was so broke in grad school. But I started out as a cartoonist and a journalist, and along the way, read, voraciously, of course. Cartoonists do read a lot, so we can get ideas from all kinds of different, sources. And it was around the time when I was 18, I got exposed to philosophy, and decided one of these days I have to get a doctorate in philosophy. I just have to. And one of the delights I discovered is how much Bradbury admired Socrates and Marcus Aurelius, among the Stoics, right? So my journey took me from drawing to scholarship, and then to writing at a certain point, novels and short stories and essays and other things. One of the things I want to emphasize, which I'm sure most of you know already, but I have to remind myself of it repeatedly, is all of the liberal arts and the humanities are interconnected. One thing will lead you to another thing. If you might want to get up one day and draw, but then the next day you might want to get up and start a short story. And the third day, you might want to get up and write an essay on a question that's been troubling you about the mind-body relationship. There is no reason why any of us should have to allow anybody to put us in a little box and say, this is all that you do. If you see my name crop up with something, it'll be Charles Johnson, novelist, but that's not the only thing I do. So all of these arts feed each other, create creatively. And when I was young, looking at Bradbury's movies, reading his short stories, I felt that spirit, of openness and the excitement that just comes from doing something, not, as Bradbury said, for money or fame. First, it's for the love of doing it. You get money and fame later if you get it. Well, that's fine. But that's not your motivation. Your motivation is the fact that when you create, you're creating yourself. With every canvas, with every novel, with every story, with every poem, you're realizing your own individual inherent potential as a human being who can, through craft, give a gift to the world of beauty, goodness, and truth, goodness, and beauty that may enrich the lives of others. That's why I think we create and why we honor this guy. Now shut up.
Mr. Barnes, if you wouldn't mind just...
No, I was a relatively poor kid, grew up in a broken home in South Central Los Angeles, and I knew that the world that was presented to me was not the real world. I knew that there were some things that were said to me about who I was and what my potential was and what my people were that was not accurate. So as many people did, I think a large number of people in the science fiction, fantasy, fanish community are people who grew up feeling like the world inside them that they connected with was not the same as the world that they saw, and that they looked to the stars, they looked to the past, they looked to other worlds and other winds to get a sense of, in some ways, what might be truer, that science fiction is a fiction of ideas and concepts, that, what if only, if this goes on, often anchored to physics, but sometimes about the human heart, but usually if there are two questions that are central to philosophy, those questions are probably who am I and what is true? What is it to be human and what is the world that human beings perceive? And science fiction approaches it in one way. Mm-hmm. Fantasy approaches it in another. Fantasy is not about the world of physics. It's about the world of symbols and the human heart and the way these things interact. It's about the poetry, what's happening kind of between the atoms, kind of between the events. So whereas science fiction has to be both internally and externally consistent, connected to physics, as I said, fantasy has to only be internally consistent, that within this we are talking about human heart, human perception, And what are we and how do we feel this? Bradbury drew my attention. I was reading voraciously at that time because I was looking for, that question, who am I and what is true? So I slept in a bedroom with the walls lined with books. And Ray Bradbury was interesting because he was published in science fiction magazines, but he was not writing about what if in that way. He wasn't interested in the physics of the situation. He was interested in the poetics of it as if he were a fantasy writer. He was about where is the human heart in all of this. So the Martian Chronicles it was not what Voyager landed on or whatever it was that were our first rovers. I forget what the name of it was. He was interested in Edgar Rice Burroughs's Mars. He was interested in Barsoom. He was interested in the poetics of science. And because of that, he touched my heart. He was a poet writing science fiction stories being published in science fiction magazines, but you weren't going to learn anything about science by reading Ray Bradbury. What you were going to learn about was, what is it to be human? What is it to see the stars? What is it to yearn for a meaning to our lives? What are we in the vastness of the universe? And that really touched this young kid trying to figure out who he was. The vision of the universe in that sense was so large that individual political or philosophical differences that deviled us on Earth are meaningless once you start backing up. When astronauts talk about how when they were in orbit, they looked down at the world and there were no divisions of nations and they had a spiritual experience. So they said the first day everybody was pointing out the city they came from. The next day when they were talking about the International Space Station, they were talking about what nations they came from. The next day after that, they were talking about the continent. And then by the fourth day, they're just looking at the world. And those individual differences dissolve. When you look at the world in terms of a sound of thunder going back 100 million years or forward into the future, the problems that we have right now politically or in terms of nations and the joining together of different groups of people who've been separated by large amounts of geography, all that stuff disappears. The question of what is the difference between this civilization and that civilization, it might be 1,000 years of development, but 1,000 years of development is nothing in terms of the 13.7 billion years that this universe has existed. It's nothing at all. Those differences dissolve. And that was the world that I wanted to live in, a world in which those differences that were necessary, because the human mind works in terms of what is similar as opposed to what is different. That dualism created a lot of our science and so forth and so on. But ultimately getting caught in the middle of that, you are not this because of that. You are this because of this. If you feel caught in that, then taking that larger perspective can feel like taking a breath of fresh air for the first time, of stepping outside anything anyone ever said about who you were or what your potential was, and being lost in the poetry of experience. So my connection to Bradbury was that I sought the poetry in the mundane, the unusual in the daily. And he went there. Every time he went there. From his earliest stories, which were often what are called biter bit stories, where somebody does a bad thing and they are destroyed by the consequences of their action. In these old, pulp magazines, and stories of ghastlies and murders and ghosts and goblins. I just ate that up because I would read him and I would read other people who wrote the same thing, but Bradbury was always about something more than the events and the actions. There we go. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, who I am, growing up in the shadow of giants, one of whom was the man that we come here to honor today, is a kid who grew up in South Central Los Angeles, wanted to be a science fiction writer, found a great mentor in Larry Niven, who was one of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century, who took me under his wing, showed me how to do it, gave me opportunities. I was able to build a life. I published over 3 million words, and the New York Times bestseller list, and this award and that award. That's all fine. But the important thing is I got to spend my life doing the thing I dreamed of as a kid. That was the reward. Just to be able to do that, to be able to every day talk to the little kid inside me and say, I've kept the faith, and for him to look at me and say, Dad, you sure did. That is worth, there is nothing I would exchange that for. And Ray Bradbury was one of the shining lights that said it was possible to get all the way there and never sell yourself out.
Yeah. Can I add something to that?
Of course.
One of the things Bradbury gives us, and it gave me as a young person, I hear you saying, Bradbury gave it to you too, is a sense of mystery and wonder about this existence in which we find ourselves. The whole thing with the view from the sciences, right, from the solar system, moving all the way out to galaxies, is our problems seem so infinitesimally small and trivial, and race so small and trivial when we take that perspective. So science fiction as an intellectual discipline allows us to dream.
Yes.
One of my colleagues, the late Joanna Russ, once pointed out that...
The female man, Joanna Russ?
Yeah.
Oh,
she
cool.
was my colleague at UW, University of Washington. She once wrote that a woman wrote to her about why she loved science fiction. She lived in a kind of ordinary town, very, very boring and conformist. But science fiction, what she really found appealing were the landscapes. The landscapes so different from the ones that she was living in, right? It opened up the imagination. Science fiction has always served that purpose, I think.
Well, Ray Bradbury, if I may add to what you're saying, is that he might quibble with something that you said there. It isn't about developing your ability to dream. It's about remembering it.
Remembering?
That we all go quietly insane every night. But we forget that, and that creativity, to a certain degree, is simply opening up a pore between our unconscious minds that dream every night and the conscious mind that performs. It does, the performative part of our mind, the part of us that says, I am. And the child has that, and life keeps telling the child, be practical.
Right.
Stay here.
Right.
And we'll start shutting that down. Ray Bradbury never lost that thing. Yeah. He never lost that connection with the child. And there are people who will say that all there is of genius is maintaining the creativity of a child with the disciplined knowledge of an adult. That if you can do that, if you can maintain a connection there, you are going to be performing at the highest level that you are capable of performing. It isn't gaining something that you don't have. It's remembering how you started. It's remembering the creativity and the aliveness and the sense of wonder and that sense of engagement that every child has, that get squeezed out of us by the adult world.
Yeah, I know. And that's what we want to keep alive.
Yes.
That child. Bradbury also put a lot of emphasis on the importance of the subconscious too. So I'm glad you pointed that out. We always have to, I think, think how do we get back to that innocence, that openness that we had as children before the world beat it out of us, or before critics, beat it out of us. And so that's one of the reasons that Sharon Skeeter there and I are both practicing Buddhists. My practice, at least, gets rid of an awful lot of that conditioning from childhood on, from parents and teachers, so that I can experience the world with that sense of newness and wonder and mystery.
You do have that. I've commented to people that one of the things I love about you is how easily you are astonished. That it's like you're constantly rediscovering. Yeah, see, you see it right there? You're constantly discovering, oh, the world is here? Look at this. You still have that. You're not numb. It hasn't been scabbed over. Your nerves are alive. You're strong enough that you're not afraid to feel. Okay? And I think that when we lose courage, fatigue makes cowards of us all. Often as we age or as we get tired or as we shape our egos to fit into the different molds that people want us to shape into,
right,
we start forgetting who we are and that we started this life to enjoy it, that we want that sense of joy, and instead of that we settle for not being afraid, if at best.
Yeah, we can't lose that.
You cannot.
Yeah, a human being cannot lose that and still be fully alive. One of the things I would like to think is my capacity. One of the things at least in my work as a philosophical novelist, is I think that literature should liberate our perceptions. Liberate our perception. You say astonishment? I would like to be able to look at something as if I've never seen it before. It's often been said of very creative people, they look at something strange as if it's familiar, and the familiar as if it's strange, right? So we're constantly working with consciousness and our perception. Listen here, every moment that we're alive is new. Every single moment is alive. The past, I've written a lot of historical fictions and so forth, but the past is past. And the future, I'm not going to worry about it because it ain't come and it never will, because that's a horizon, the future that we can never reach. The only moment we have right here with each other is right here, right now. Before I came over here, I sat for a little bit of meditation. I always do that. I would not meet a group or a crowd or do anything in public until I had that chance to sit, if only for 10 or 15 minutes, so that I could be here, right here, with all of you right now, in the only moment that exists in time, not worrying about what am I going to do when we're done with this, or what was the flight like getting us here with no sleep, from Seattle, right here, right now, new. Never like this moment before. You get up in the morning, wash your face, you got the soap, okay, that has never happened before. You might think I'm doing a routine thing. No, not that soap, not that water, not that moment.
And not that version of you.
And not that version of me, you're right.
You can't step in the same piece of water twice because your foot is never the same and the water has changed.
That's right.
So it's that awareness that the sacred is in the mundane, that it is in this moment. What I try to do is to center myself and then ask myself, what is the task to do next? Task may be to get out of bed and have breakfast. It may be to embrace my wife. It may be to console my son. It may be to play with the cat. It might be to answer an email. It might be to write a story. But all those, I'm not different people when I do those things. I'm the same person playing different roles. So let me be appropriate. The question is, can I be appropriate in this moment? Can I be here with this moment and the demands of this moment with the story that I'm writing or the person that I'm speaking to or the task that I have to do?
Be here totally right now.
Yes.
30% of yourself isn't trapped in the past, remembering, regretting. 30% is not projecting into the future what you're going to do. You bring back all of yourself, 100%, to this moment right now. Whether it's writing, whether it's talking to your son or me talking to my grandson, you're here totally right at this moment.
It's one of the reasons why the martial arts are such a great tool for learning that. Because 1 second of not thinking about right here and you get hit in the head.
That's right.
So there's nothing like a smack upside the head to wake you up and realize, oh, I better be here now. You better forget about the hamburger I had yesterday or what my wife's going to say when I get home. This guy's going to knock my head off right here, right now, in this instant.
There is no other moment in time.
There is no other moment in time.
That's it.
And that sense of being there is consistent across all arts. And so this conversation concerning getting hit in the head.
Look, it's like an athlete in the zone.
Yes.
In the zone, right?
Yes.
So go on.
Well, no, it's the dissolution of the subject-object relationship. There is not a you and it. There's something that is happening here. And you're not observing yourself doing it, because when you're observing yourself, some of the energy that you would have put into that moment is put into creating a self to observe. And what's even worse is when people observe themselves observing themselves. Now you're 2 steps removed from the process. And you've lost all the energy you need to liberate your true self. So in one sense, society will try to keep you in the place of observing yourself and judging yourself, because that way you become dependent upon society to say that you're okay.
Right.
Because if you're in the moment, you know you're okay. You're always okay when you're in the moment.
Yeah.
You're not okay once you observe yourself and start judging yourself. But when you're there and it's just happening, that's when you're totally alive. And that's what we look for in sexuality, in driving on the freeway and in heavy traffic in the rain, in fighting, in writing, in reading, is the sense of total engagement in the moment. The I is not observed. It is subsumed in the process of the interaction. That thing of the page opening up and you fall into the page can happen only once this component skills have been reduced to unconscious competence.
Right, right. As you can tell, we talked a lot together. And we have long conversations like this, but this gentleman here may have.
I was going to say that this is the easiest job I've ever had. If they were paying me, man, I definitely, the interesting thing is, the one, I think it was like the one time I got a chance to, I think Jason and I were on a Zoom with you, and a similar conversation happened, and we were like in the chat, like, hey man, let's just stay here. They don't notice us. Let's just listen and get it. So that's what. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that I am a fill-in. Dr. Rhonda Henry was ill and could not make it. She would have been the person here today. So I did want to lift her up and mention that as well. So thank you, first of all. Thank you for that opening salvo.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah.
See you later. Oh, no, we're still. Okay.
We got one more.
Got one more.
So I do have one more thing, and this is more specific. You've certainly touched on it. You showed us these were. These,
yeah. These I purchased some years ago the complete line of Planet stories from the late 30s to the early 50s. These are the original issues. And they have Bradbury's original stories in them, and a lot of other people too, who became famous. But this is where he began, with the pulps. And I wanted to have the actual feel of that underneath my fingers. See, one of the beautiful things about Bradbury and the pulp writers, to me, is they're prolific. They were not worried about, am I writing something that will last for the ages? No. Bradbury is getting $20 to $40 per story. He's making himself write 1,000 words a day, a story a week. He's got to sell 2 a month in order to pay his bills, okay? He is immersed in the moment. These precede comic books, okay, by a few years, and the comic book artists were the same people. You were not looking back. You were immersed in the moment of creation. You had a deadline to meet.
That's right.
And you produced all this stuff not thinking that this might shape culture, that the characters that you're creating, from Edgar Rice Burroughs to the Marvel characters, that these would be installed in popular culture 50 years later, so that even my grandson knows these characters, right? I admire artists who work like that, who don't think that what they're doing is precious, but what they're doing is absolutely everything they can do at the present moment.
Yes.
And then you let it go, and you go on to the next one.
Yes.
And you go on to the next one. And you're blessed to be able to have the opportunity to do that.
And that certainly was going to be, kind of the next question I wanted to throw out there, very open-ended, of course, but just the idea of, Bradbury's influence. I know you've touched on it a little bit, but just maybe if there was any particular specific.
Oh, I absolutely can. I'd let you can go first, or I can go there, or whatever is appropriate.
I want to hear your stories about Bradbury.
Okay. Anybody want to hear my stories about Ray Bradbury?
Okay. Stories.
Because he was very important in my life, and I did not write this out because I know for a fact that I'm going to get choked up. So get ready for that. And I wrote down some dates just so I could get as precise as I could, but this is not a formal, scholarly thing. So if any of the dates are wrong, apologies in advance. So I grew up and I had a dream of being a science fiction writer. It was a thing that I really loved to do because I didn't understand math well enough to be a scientist. So I did the other thing. I could write poetry of the sciences. And so I was a little kid growing up in South Central LA and had dreams of being a writer, and I was writing as much as possible. And everything around me told me that I could not do it. My dad was a backup singer for Nat King Cole, and I was in the studio when they did the background vocals for Ramblin' Rose.
Really?
Just watching Dad. And every time it's on the radio, I hallucinate that I could hear my dad's baritone.
Wow.
And my dad's singing career ultimately floundered, and it led to a divorce. And so my mom was terrified that if I followed the arts, that I would have a similar failure. And she used to tear my stories up and burn them because she was so scared that I would go down that path. But I just kept going and kept going and kept going. And by the time I got to college, I had I knew my mom wanted me not to write, and so I tried to step away from writing. But I was tricking myself. I'd take all kind of other classes. I would take, drama and composition and English and speech and stuff like this, work in the radio station, things adjacent to writing, without writing. And then finally they had a contest, a writing contest on campus, where the winner would read a story to the alumni. And I won the contest, and I read the story to the alumni, and I watched them react to me, and I realized this is who I'm supposed to be. That I would rather fail as a writer than succeed at anything else. So I dropped out of college. My girlfriend at the time, who later became my wife, and I were living together, and she was an artist and I was a writer, and I was taking jobs adjacent to Hollywood trying to work my way in. I was also writing stories, and I was starting to send them out, and I was getting rejected and rejected and rejected. And I think that at some point I started getting like 1/5 of a cent a word and getting paid in contributors' copies. But I think before my first sale, I wrote a story, a Halloween story called Trick or Treat, about a guy who, when he was a kid, his candy is snatched by the kids in the neighborhood. They were bullies. And when he becomes an adult, he starts, the kids in the neighborhood, he's living in the same house, they're playing tricks on him, so he plays tricks back. And the next year, they play a nastier trick. And the year after that, he plays a nastier trick on them. And it goes back and forth until one year he plays a trick, and he accidentally kills a kid. And he knows that next year they're going to kill him. Wow. And so this story is called Trick or Treat, and I found out that Ray Bradbury was doing an autographing at a bookstore, and so my girlfriend was an artist, and I created a Halloween card that contained the story and artwork, and we went to his signing, and we gave it to him in an envelope that had my address on it. And about 6 weeks later, I got a letter back from Ray Bradbury saying he loved my story. And this was the first time a professional human being, a person who was doing the thing that I wanted to do, let alone somebody who I admired so much, had said, yeah, kid, maybe you've got what it takes. It meant more than I can possibly say and inspired me to keep going. So I kept going, and I'm writing, and I'm trying to do this, and I'm trying to do that. And I'm still not succeeding very much, but I was starting to make a little bit of progress. My mom, who had always been terrified, finally realized that there was no way I was going to give it up, and so she kind of got on the bandwagon, and she found a course that was being taught at UCLA Extension by Robert Kirsch, who was the literary editor of the LA Times in about 1980, let's say, 1975. And no. This was about 1980. And so I took a class from Robert Kirsch, and it was a strange class. It was the little blue-haired lady writing astrological poetry, and there was the guy writing this, and I was writing these strange stories. And I wrote one very strange story called "Is Your Glass Half Empty?" about a compulsive gambler who hawks his pacemaker. And Kirsch looked at me, and he didn't know quite what to make of this story, and he said, I've got a friend I'd like to show this story to. Would you mind if I did that? And I said, sure, go right ahead. And about 6 weeks later, I got a letter from Ray Bradbury, who was Robert Kirsch's friend, telling me again. He didn't remember the earlier story. He just said, hey, kid, this is good. That you've got something. Go for it. Don't ever give up doing that Ray Bradbury inspirational thing. I kind of said, I got 2 letters from him. This is cool. So let me keep going. I eventually met Larry Niven and began working with him and started getting my career going. And
what year did you publish your first story?
I published my first story in probably about 1980, 1981, somewhere in there, maybe 79 to 81, somewhere in there, and it was like 1/5 of a cent a word. And then the first story that was published in a professional magazine was called it's called Endurance Vile, about an athlete who accidentally discovers a meditation that triggers his ability to be more of an athlete, and he starts running and he can't stop. So I think that was my very first publication. And I was working with Larry Niven, and I had the balls to walk up to Larry, at the Losfus science fiction thing, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Niven, my name is Stephen Barnes, and I'm a writer." And he looked at me and said, "All right, tell me a story." I found out that from the way I'd come on to him, I had about 10 seconds to prove I wasn't an asshole. Luckily, I just put that story, "Is Your Glass Half Empty?" into the mail that morning, so I was able to stumble out, I think, and that led to us eventually working together in my working. He gave me a chance to work on an earlier story of his that he hadn't been able to finish to his satisfaction, called The Locusts, which was about a group of space colonists who go to a planet and their children begin to devolve to Australopithecines, and they don't know how to deal with it. And if the problem in the story, yeah, who would, right? If the problem in the story had been biology, or cryptozoology, or physics, or astrophysics, I would have been lost. But luckily, the problem in the story was the psychology. That Larry did not understand group psychology as well as I think he could have, such that he did not understand the impact that would have on that little colony if these things happen. He was underestimating the emotions involved. So that gave me an opening, a way that I could contribute something to this story, and it led to a Hugo nomination and my first real publication, with Larry. So it was like, wow, this was, I'm on my way. So one of the things that I was asked to do in this process was, there was something called the Planetary Society, in which I was asked to be a presenter, to be an announcer. So I introduced several luminaries that were there, astrophysicists, and there might have been an astronaut, so forth. And one of the people was Ray Bradbury. So Ray walked up on stage, and before he walked up on stage, I told my story about how he was responsible for me getting published by giving me inspiration at a time when I was getting rejection after rejection after rejection, and starting to question myself. And he walked up on stage and gave me a big hug, and it was just a great moment. Everybody applauded. It was very nice. Yeah. About 8 years after that, I was teaching a class at UCLA. And it was a symposium, and every week we had a different notable come. And one week it was Ray Bradbury. So I went to Ray's house. Huh?
He came to class.
He came and talked at the symposium. He was one of the, I think, 7 notables that we had coming there. And before the class, I took him to dinner in Westwood. And Larry Niven had asked if he could keep me. But before Larry got there, for 20 years, I was the only black male science fiction writer in the world, so far as I could determine. Chip Delaney had left the field. He'd gone into academia and queer fiction because he couldn't make a living in science fiction. I survived largely because of my partnership, my mentorship with Larry Niven, because I would do collaboration with him, and I'd make enough money to be able to keep food on the table and a roof over our head. But I was starting to wonder, was I losing myself? Had I sold myself out? Was I losing my art? And I remember I had dinner with Leo and Diane Dillon, who we were just talking about, in Greenwich Village, and they were the essence of art. It was like they did art together, where one would start a line, the other one would finish it, and back. And I was sitting at that table talking to them about the career of an artist, thinking I'd get some tips from my wife, who was interested in being a professional artist. And I suddenly realized that I didn't care about that. What I wanted to know was, had I sold myself out? Had I sold out my heart? And I sat there, and I just poured my eyes out, and I just started crying. Finally, I realized, because I was in the presence of real artists here. This was for real, and I felt like a fraud. I felt like a phony, and I poured my heart out to them, and I finally said, "Is it too late for me?" And they looked at each other, and Diane looked at her husband, and then she reached across the table and she took my hands, and she said, "Steve, if you can even ask that question, it's not too late." Well, that helped. But I was sitting at the table with Ray Bradbury, my childhood idol, who somehow I had choreographed an opportunity to be with him and break bread with him and speak with him. And it was pretty much the same question. It's like, I've been hiding behind Larry Niven and his partner, Jerry Pornell. I'm writing these things and I've gotten these awards and made this money and so forth, but I feel like, I don't know, am I broken? Is it too late for me? Can I still touch that part of me that's sacred? And he asked me a question. He said, have you published? And I said, oh yeah, I published all these stories and about 6 books and this, that, and the other. He just started laughing. He just laughed. He said, oh, you are going to have no problem at all. And hearing that for the second time is what made the difference. I was able to see that I was just on this road. I did not see Ray again for many years. And then in maybe the end of 2011 or the beginning of 2012, I was asked if I would make a presentation at a acknowledgement dinner for Ray Bradbury, who was very ill. He could barely speak. He was in his wheelchair, and it was held at the Universal Sheraton sometime late 2011 or early 2012. And I got up on the stage. It was so good to see him, and he was so diminished physically, but the child self was still so alive in him. His eyes were still so alive, and I told the story of how he had reached out to me when I was getting started, and he'd written these letters giving me hope, helping me believe that maybe it was possible for me to have the life that I wanted. How grateful I was for a chance to say thank you to this great man. And after I finished, he held out his arms and he gave me a hug, and I went home, and 6 weeks later, I got a letter from him telling me, thanking me for the words I'd said and how it had reminded him of his own path and his own joy and his gratitude for the life that he had had and the fact that he'd been able to touch others. And the last words in that letter were, some of your tears are my own, Ray Bradbury. And about 6 weeks after that, he passed away. And I just wanted to say, there is no greater gift in life than being able to take a look at the child you were and the dreams that they had, and realize that you were actually able to live that life, and that there was no possible way that you could have done it alone. And that being able to talk to other people along the path who say, you're not remotely at their level, not remotely, but they don't care. All they care about is, are you writing? Are you reading? Are you teaching? Where are you? What does the territory look like from where you are? And I just wanted to say that everybody in this room has walked a path that others wish they could walk, has answered questions that other people can't even formulate yet. And you never know what a kind word or a kind act is going to mean. His actions meant the difference between life and death for part of my soul. And I could not be who I am were it not for people who had been kind to me, who saw me and saw some potential within me, and reached out their hand and said, you're going to have no problem at all. And I thank you for the chance to come here and say publicly how much I owe those people and one specific man, one great man, Ray Bradbury, who changed and saved my life.
Question.
I want to pick up on two things that you said, Steve. I know in my life there were individuals who encouraged me when I couldn't get that encouragement from anywhere else. And when you're young, you're tender. You know, you're in your teens. And, you know, I'm not going to belabor, you know, and bore you with those individuals who did that for me. But that's an extremely important thing for a young person, an old person too, to have somebody who gives you permission to go that route and to trust yourself and to trust your passion. That could be a teacher. You've also written about a teacher in high school who, you know, positively gave you reinforcement.
Miss Elaine Otterness.
Yes, so those teachers are extremely important in our lives. And I've had several, you know, when I was a cartoonist, and then the novelist John Gardner, when I started writing novels, and he led me into the book world, which I knew nothing about. And then later, you know, when I was in philosophy with my dissertation director, who became a dear friend, who's actually passing away right now. But those teachers are extraordinarily important. But there's something else you said I'd like you to say a bit more about. You worked with Niven.
Yes.
Collaboratively.
Yes.
And you're wondering, what's happening to me? You know, where am I? You know? So is that the opening, that question, that led you to, and Tanana Reeve, to Afrocentrism? Is that how you found your way there?
Well, okay. Afrofuturism, you mean?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Afrofuturism.
Afrofuturism.
Well, all that happened is that I worked with Larry Niven and his partner, Jerry Pournelle, and I learned the basics of my craft, and I already had the basics of my craft. I came to them with a certain amount of skills that were developed, but then they took me to being a professional. I remember, you know, Jerry, I don't know how many writers in world history have ever had the experience of two world-class writers, best-selling writers, award-winning writers, sitting on opposite sides of the room, tearing apart their work at the same time. Because I was working on a book with the two of them. And Pournelle was taking great pleasure in this. He's, Barnes, we're ripping apart Barnes's precious prose. Barnes, was your mother scared by a gerund? I mean, you know, he would take... He took such glee in ripping me a new one every single time. I would drive home from working with them crying, sobbing, because you know, just taking this battering. But it was like being asked to spar with the black belt class. Mm-hmm. You got your butt kicked every night, but you would crawl off the mat, but you'd know, if I can survive this, I'm going to be a fighter. So I knew if I could survive this, I will learn things that are taught in no school in the world. Now, one of the things is that Jerry wrote stories that Jerry wanted to read. Larry Niven wrote stories Larry Niven wanted to read. Right. So in order to be like them, it wasn't writing like Larry Niven or Jerry Pournelle. I had to write stories that Stephen Barnes wanted to read. What were those stories? And to a huge degree, there is that question, what was missing from the field? And what was missing was people who looked like me.
Right.
And it wasn't passive, it was active insult. Edgar Rice Burroughs would write stories, you know, in which Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories were, the core of Tarzan was specifically racism. Specifically the idea that an English lord gentleman raised by apes is still a gentleman, and he made racism specific in one of his stories in the Jungle Tales of Tarzan, where he says, white men have imagination, black men have little, animals have none. I mean, that really was specifically, so you can't get away from it. Right. But I needed those stories because I was trying to define myself as a man and where I am in the universe. So as I once said to a group, that I sacrificed my melanin on the altar of my testosterone. I mean, I wanted to be a man more than I cared about being black.
I would add something. You brought something to Pournelle and Niven that they didn't have.
Yes.
From your perspective and your history. They did not have the black orientation, any of that.
No.
So, but I don't know if that worked into the books that you did.
Not that much. I mean, Jerry was by his own statement, politically to the right of Attila the Hun. Okay. So it was difficult to navigate that territory. But one of the things I learned was how to argue with somebody smarter than you. because Jerry was just smarter than me. Just, Jerry's brain had a rocket attached to it. Larry's brain had a transporter attached to it. Whereas I could understand how Jerry would do stuff. It was just an ordinary brain with a lot more information working a lot faster. But Larry would dematerialize and materialize someplace else. It's like, I don't even know how you got there. So taking their lessons and then writing my own stories demanded that I write from my own experience. So I'm then dealing with the fact that, my first book was a book with Larry. My second book was a book with Larry. My third book was a solo book. And I wrote a black character. I specifically wanted to create a black hero.
What book is this?
That was Street Lethal.
Street Lethal, okay.
Yeah, but the book company, Ace, put a white guy on the cover. He's very clearly described as being as dark as a Zulu, and they put a white guy on the cover. And my poor editor called me up, and she's in tears. Poor Beth Meacham was her name. Very nice lady, not her fault. She said that they had done this. Susan Allison, who was the head editor, I don't have as good a feeling about her because she kind of blew it off. She wasn't upset. Well, it's one of those things that happened. It was the marketing department. And I talked to the marketing department. Oh, no, it's the art department. I talked to the art department. The art department said, well, it's the sales department. And the sales department said, well, the truck drivers who are going to put the books on the stands would think that this was Shaft in space. And so I realized at that point, I can either hate white people. I'd rather not do that. Did I say that out loud? No. No, I could either hate white people or I consider that what's going on here is an example of how human beings think. That human beings feel protective of their tribe, and almost all human beings are tribal. They happen to have that power. Everybody wants to rule the world. Everybody wants to feel that the world reflects who they are in the mirror. So I'm just at an unfortunate effect of this. What do I do with it? I can either use this and say, the world kicked my ass, or I can say, this is where we are right now. My dad, working with Nat King Cole, performed in hotels in Las Vegas where he could not stay. The world has gotten better than that. It's just not as good as I would like it to be. How much longer will it take? And I projected trend lines in my mind. I thought it might take 2 generations. It might take 2 generations. It might take another 30 to 40 years before the world is ready for the stories that I want to tell. Can I survive long enough to do that? And so I started a program of I'm going to stay in this field, and I'm going to create my stories, and I'm going to do everything I can do because I'm going to make it, first of all, I'm going to write stories that the kid who started this path would have wanted to read. And I'm going to create a career path so that other people coming in will have an easier time than I have. And Octavia Butler and I were the only black people working in the field. We had many conversations about this. We lived walking distance from each other, and Octavia was a level above me as a writer. She was often not happy with what I wrote because she felt I was not living up to my potential. She would write, and they'd put green people on the covers of her books, but they wouldn't put black people. So we had lots of interesting conversations about that. What do we feel about it? What are we going to do? I felt if I can stay in here and write the stories that I want, stories that would nurture the younger person I was, then no matter what happens, I've not been beat. And then I found out one day that there were scholars studying something called Afrofuturism, and I was considered to be an Afrofuturist. I didn't try to be one. I was just trying to write Stephen Barnes stories.
You just casually said that you lived walking distance from Octavia Butler. I want to point that out.
Oh yeah, she used to come over for dinner, and I'd go over to her place, and then we would just sit and we'd talk writing and life. She was like my big sister.
I just wanted to point that out.
You go back to what is it, the 20s, the 30s, and you've got Black No More, that early sci-fi work. And then you fast forward a little bit, and you got Chip Delaney, and he said he couldn't make a living. So he moved on. Incredibly elegant. Elegant prose stylist.
Amazing.
And then you have Octavia Butler, and then there's you.
Yeah.
That's about it. And now we have a lot of people
Tons
doing
of them.
sci-fi.
Can't even count them.
Yeah, but you
got
guys
one of
were
the best sitting
you
right
guys
there.
were the pioneers You were the pioneers, which is really quite incredible when you think back about
Remember, pioneers get arrows in the butt. You know, I was just trying to be the best writer that I could be, and trying to survive, trying to take care of my family, and trying to survive in Hollywood. And I made mistakes. I betrayed that little creative spark inside me a couple of times, and it hurt. I mean, I was just, you can only sell yourself out so much.
Yeah.
What's even worse is if you try not to sell out, and then one day you sell out and nobody's buying. So that's even worse.
Right.
But I remember one of my agents, I walked away from one of my agents in Hollywood because I walked in there with my heart on my sleeve, and I said, I don't know what's going to happen in my career, but when I leave Hollywood, I want to leave with my sense of honor intact. And he looked at me and he said, "You'll be the only one." Really? And I realized at that moment, he and I did not understand each other at all. Right. I need to find a new agent because I'm not going to sell my soul to do this. I'm going to do everything I can. I will not sell out, but I will rent myself. And I will stretch as far as I can, but I'm always going. I'm kind of a hoe, but but I enjoy my work. Oh my God. If I write an episode of Baywatch, and I wrote 4 episodes of Baywatch, and people say, that's not science fiction. I said, you ever see those silicon life forms running around on the beach? I found something in every episode that I could actually care about. And there's another story I can go into that I might tell another time where the producers did eventually end up turning on me, but I got revenge. But that's another story.
We'll first, before, yeah.
No, go.
Okay.
Go.
Before, I think we can open up to a little bit of a Q&A. Sure. But before we do that, of course, we want to just really thank you for your words and candor.
Have you said everything you wanted to say? You came prepared with some comments, didn't you, Chuck? You came prepared with some comments. Have you expressed what you wanted to express?
I came prepared with some...
You had some comments. You were almost going to write a talk to do this, but instead of that, you prepared some comments. I just wanted to be sure that Charles has had an opportunity to express himself to the full.
No. I'm fine.
Okay,
and
cool.
I think it's probably a good idea if you want to move to that next phase.
Yes, but before we did that,
let's thank
these wonderful discussants.
Yeah, man.
Respect.
Just trying to be like you.
No, you don't want to, believe me.
So what we could do is, the aisles could be your pathway, or if you so choose, you could just kind of raise. I can't see you because of the lights, so perhaps you might want to stand up. Or okay, they just raised the house lights.
Did they raise the
lights?
So
if you could they just did, so I could see folks. So if you have a question, if you have a comment, please just raise your hand, and I will catch you. Not everybody at once. There we go.
Tumbleweed.
We got one. Yeah. And you'll have to project because I don't think we have a walking mic.
Your big voice.
Oh, it's over here. There we go. Okay. No, they were writing them out. Even better.
So if you have questions that you have written out, we've got 3 folks that you can pass them to the center.
What
Okay.
is that?
They've got questions on index cards.
Oh, I see that people wrote already.
Yes.
All right. This
All
is
right.
good. This is good because I can read them all now. Okay, come on. Yeah, I'll just get them all at once. Don't do it. All right, I'm gonna start here. Okay, we ready? Okay. So I think this one is for both of you. And so this person says that they want to say that they appreciate that you both came out to speak with us this evening, and they love hearing your stories. The question is there a book that you wrote that holds the most significance to you? If so, would you be okay with sharing your thoughts on the story? And then there's a little statement at the bottom that says, on the day When life seems to be too much to handle with all that you do? Okay, that's the second question. So let's go with the first question. Is there a particular book that you wrote that holds the most significance to you? And if so, would you share your thoughts on the story?
I can do that easily.
Okay.
The most significant book for me was my second novel called Oxford Tale, which was rejected 24 times. Nobody understood it. My own mentor, John Gardner, did not understand it and actually was afraid of the Buddhism that was in this novel, which is in the form of a slave narrative, philosophical novel in the form of a slave narrative, with access to Western and Eastern philosophy. And my editor didn't understand it for my first book, and but that was critical. Had I not done that book, all the other books that I've done, 26, after, total 27, I would not have done it. I had to do that book. And once I did that book, I understood some things about myself. I wrote the book to free myself of my passion in reading of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism from my teens. So I'm going to write this book, and I'm going to be free of it. Got to the end of the book, I realized, no, this is the beginning for me. So everything I've done has been, in a way, referenced back to Oxford Tale, which has a Bradbury connection, because there is a soul catcher, a slave hunter named Horace Bannon, who has tattoos. All the black people that he captures or kills, he gets tattoos on his body. That where is that going to come from except the Illustrated Man, right? Which I read when I was younger. So that was a critical book for me. I'll say that much. Yeah. So that's my
For me,
example.
it would almost certainly be Lion's Blood. Lion's Blood, which was my statement on race relations in America. Basically, it took me 6 years of research, and I basically created an alternate history in which it was an alternate America that was colonized by Islamic Africans, bringing, in this particular instance, Irish slaves here. And so the story it deals with a young Irish boy named Aidan O'Dare, who is kidnapped by Vikings and sold to the Moors in Spain, in Andalus, the word for Spain, and brought to Balalistan, the United States, to the province of New Djibouti, Texas, where he becomes the footboy, slave of Kai ibn Jalaluddin ibn Rashid, who is a young Islamic nobleman. And the story covers their friendship for about 8 years, from childhood to the beginnings of adulthood. And I don't know if I'll ever work that hard on a book again. I probably will not.
I remember what you said. You invited scholars to a party to ask them questions.
Yeah, I basically knew that I could spend 100 years researching and still not touch 1% of what I needed to know. So I did one of the smartest things I've ever done. It's probably one of the 10 smartest things I've done in my life. I invited a room full of the smartest people that I knew, and people came from hundreds of miles. They took my invitation, and we had a pizza party all day long. I fed them pizza and beer, and I had graph paper and butcher paper on the walls, and I passed out notebooks with the basic premises of the world, the politics and the economics and so forth of this alternate universe. And I had a videographer following people around, and all day long we theorized about this world that I was trying to create, and they showed me everything. They showed me so many things that I had not thought of, that by the end of that single day, I had enough research to begin the writing process. I'd done 6 years of research before I did that party. So my attitude is you want to know enough to ask the right questions of experts.
Right.
And if you can ask an expert the right question and they say, oh, yes, well, that's, and they go off, then you know enough to write your story.
This is a perfect example of what they call world building.
Yeah.
World building. And you went on to do a sequel or more than two.
Well, I did 2 of them, Lion's Blood and Zulu Heart.
Zulu Heart, yeah.
Okay. All right. And so we have a good number of questions. I think we could.
Okay, let's.
Time.
I'll keep it shorter.
No. But we're good. I think everybody here is enjoying being able to hear.
Is this
from
okay,
you,
guys?
So I think we're all right.
This what you came for? It's all about you. You can't pry me out of the house. But once I'm out of the house, I really do want to serve whoever brought me out. So this is your chance.
Okay. And then for anyone out there, if I misread anything, feel free to correct me. Given that we celebrate creativity, originality, and the process of fantasy, is naming things a reductive act?
You would
No,
like to try that?
Is naming things?
Is naming things a reductive act?
Well, that's a big epistemological question.
Of course.
I mean,
How would you answer that?
to name something is to give it a nature. That's one way you could talk about this. To name something is to limit it to whatever name you've given to it. There's a lot of ways you could take this, but naming can be extremely important. God, how to talk about this? I guess people who are Chinese have 4 or 5 different names. You know, a birth name, and then I'm going to let you feel that one.
It is reductive, but then again, all language is reductive. All language is a reification of something. All language is a symbol, and it's possible to mistake the menu for the meal. Right. You know, if you go, you know, kind of stepping into my Korzybski for a second. But language is all we have. You know, we're communicating with people. You say, well, you go in the other room and get, what do you say? You know, the salty thing, the thing that makes things taste sharper. You've just used labels for things. The concept of taste, you've used a label for. The concept of something that is bitter as opposed to sweet, as opposed to salty. All those things are labels. All words are nothing more than that. And what you do with language, I remember Chip Delaney in his book, The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, on writing, he talks about the fact that every word creates an impression. You know, okay, it's this definite article. The boy, okay, we getting a noun in here. The boy ran, it got a verb. The boy ran from, oh, okay, now we're getting a sense of direction. That just as music is what happens between the notes, poetry is what happens between the words. As you hear a word and your brain does what's called a transderivational search for the meaning of that word, it's the journey that people go on between the words that creates the impression of art. It's like, you know, this note followed by that note. What happens in between there? The negative space is what an artist is manipulating. Mm-hmm. Or it's the thing that we don't see. We see the words, but we don't see the space between the words. Mm-hmm. Like we see the trees, but we don't see the space between them, but it's the space between them. The trees punctuate that space to create a forest. Mm-hmm. So the labels that we use not necessarily to define things, but to guide consciousness. Yeah. You know, think about this. Now think about this. Now think about this. What is the journey you go on between the words? That's the thing that the artist plays with that people do not see. And that is in some ways the most important thing. And you only learn to get there by concentrating on the words, and then at some point you see the forest that you have created with the use of those words. It's one of the reasons why the first draft, it's so important to just, as far as I'm concerned, just vomit it out. Your first draft should be trash. Mm-hmm. Just get it out there. What Bradbury referred to as running barefoot through the grass. Let your first draft be done from pure love. Then the rewrite process is where you're adjusting and playing with it. But just get that first draft out there. Don't try to make your first draft meaningful. Don't try to make it good. Don't try to, make the work of the masters. Just write down the music that you're hearing and adjust it later.
And then rewrite and rewrite.
And rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I keep mentioning Charles Delaney.
Chip Delaney.
Call him Chip. I don't know him.
Samuel R. Delaney.
I'm sorry. Okay. I don't know him well enough to, I know who he is. I've read his work, but I don't know him. See, I know, you just casually mentioned Octavia Butler, so I'm sure you know Chip Delaney. Well enough to come to. Anyway, I'm gonna stop joking around here. So this question is about Mr. Delaney. Why is Delaney out of fashion? And the person mentioned that they loved reflection of light in water.
I would say it's simply because different styles of writing go in and out of fashion. Chip Delaney came into the science fiction field in the 60s, was called the New Wave, right. Where people, the first generation of science fiction were people who knew science and literature. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and so forth. The next generation of science fiction, Olaf Stapleton and people like that, knew the work of Wells, and the next generation after that, people like Robert Heinlein, they knew the Olaf Stapletons and so forth, and they were doing the same thing. But by the time you get to the 60s, there was enough science fiction literature that it actually started coming back around. Instead, that science fiction of the 30s and the 40s was justifiably mocked by literary establishment because it wasn't interested in literary qualities. It was interested in ideas, big ideas.
Well, back it up to
please.
To the first science fiction magazine, which was what?
Analog,
No.
Astounding.
No. It's even earlier than that. And
Something Planets or something.
The whole purpose of it was to teach young people science.
You're talking about Hugo Gernsback?
Gernsback.
Okay.
Yeah. The Gernsback, and that's where you get the term science fiction. It was to teach and be didactic.
Right.
However, the earlier guys, if I don't mischaracterize them, would give us the science, but they really weren't good with certain things like characterization and the virtues that go along with literature. By the time you get to the 60s, you see the shift from the hard sciences, physics, and chemistry and all that kind of stuff, to the soft sciences.
Yes.
That is to say, sociology and anthropology and blah, blah, blah. So and my colleague, Joan Russ, was part of that.
Yes, she was.
I interviewed her and Chip Delaney because we did a special issue of the Seattle Review, which I was a fiction editor of for 20 years, devoted to science fiction. So I interviewed them together in the office at the University of Washington. So I want you to finish this off. What happened to Chip Delaney?
What happened to Chip Delaney is that in the new wave, people like him and Ted Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison were playing with language. They started playing with language and deconstructing the relationship between language and consciousness to create effects in their work. So they weren't telling, straightforward stories. Bradbury was an early person who was grounded in the pulps, but used that manipulation of negative space emotionally and artistically to create an effect. He would put down one of his stories and say, this wasn't science fiction, but somehow, I want to look at the stars. Okay. Chip Delaney was in some ways, there were ways in which he was limited from writing about what he really wanted to write about, which was his sexuality and race. And he could not write about those things at that time. So he would deconstruct language and concepts of race and consciousness and so forth. And he was friggin' brilliant. He was one of the very first, if not the first, black writer that John W. Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding, which became Analog, would publish, because Campbell was a racist. I mean, I know two people who have letters from him where he stated straight out, you can't write about an advanced African civilization because Africans aren't smart enough to create one. He was one of the foundations of the field. So Chip Delaney had to hide who he was in order to write. So he hid in the world of the intellect. I will be so brilliant. When people think Chip Delaney, they will not think black. They will think brilliant. So he deliberately expressed his intellect so that people wouldn't notice his skin color. But that wears, and that's my interpretation. That's nothing he ever said directly to me about it. But that wears on you. How do you write stories for people and you feel in your heart, they don't want to know who I really am. If they acknowledge my intellect, they're making me an exception. Oh, if they were all like Chip Delaney, we wouldn't have a problem. That eventually can turn to ashes in your mouth and lead to you asking questions of Ray Bradbury and Leo and Diane Dillon. And he, at some point, got out of it, but the field moved on. That the 60s broke the box that Olaf Stapleton and Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov created by asking us to, the 60s were a time of experimentation and drugs and love and peace and so forth and so on. The generation that came after the 60s took all of that for granted, and they began exploring science fiction with simultaneously a sense of the aesthetics that lead to literature. And by the 80s and the 90s, you actually had a body of science fiction where the best of the best had both mastered storytelling and the sciences and the capacity to create art. And so Chip Delaney was forgotten to a degree because we no longer needed what it is that he had brought to the field.
There was a recent issue of a magazine, national magazine, I can't remember what it was. A friend told me about it. I didn't read it. It was a long piece on Delaney. It's a long piece on Delaney.
A genuine genius.
Huh?
Delaney was a genuine genius. No question about it. He was one of Octavia's teachers, okay? And, so to him, Octavia isn't Saint Octavia. She's a good writer, sometimes better than others, and so forth, and he's for real, he really means that. And both of them are above my level, but what they were helped make the field what it is. Okay. They were foundational.
So we got 4 more. I think we could get through them. We will need to potentially move
a little quicker.
Okay. So let's
I'm sorry.
Because I'm getting the signs, but I don't want to disrupt the flow of what's happening here. So this person says, growing up reading comics, there was plenty of violence. But now graphic novels have the power to push out, I believe it's saying out peace. What are your thoughts on that? If you could.
Push out peace.
Push out
I don't
peace.
even know what that means. If they mean that art is going to make the world more violent, I disagree with that wholeheartedly.
Okay.
I think that violence comes from being, it's like the Billy Budd syndrome. The greater your vocabulary and the more ideas you can express through language, the less you have to hit people. There is an inverse relationship in prisons between the size of vocabulary and the violence of the crime. It's been noted many times by sociologists. So the people who can play with ideas don't need to stab you.
Okay, I'm satisfied with
Okay.
I'm not going to jump into that one.
So we're moving at a steady clip. We're going to get there. Thank you, elders, for sharing your wisdom with your stories. And the question is, how do you nurture the connection between your adult self and your child self?
How do you nurture the relationship between your adult self and your child self? I'll give you a meditation that I've seen other people use. I don't know if anybody here meditates, but you can visualize this. Visualize yourself as your younger self. What if you had a time machine and you could, this has been done in movies, go back and talk to your younger self on a bad day when he or she everything went wrong, getting beat up and so forth. Visualize yourself giving yourself, that kid you were, a hug, and holding that kid for, a breath or two, and telling that kid, it's pretty bad right now, but you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and I do, and it's going to be good, right?
See, that's perfect. In my system, our pedagogy, we teach, we have a podcast, the Life Writing Podcast, www.lifewritingpodcast.com. And we talk about a technique called the ancient child.
What?
The ancient child.
Okay.
It is a technique. And it's like, you imagine that at one end of a string is the child that you were. At the other end of the string is the elder you're going to be on your deathbed. Just you're going to die tomorrow. Beyond all ego, beyond any need to look good or any of that nonsense. And all you're trying to do is move with integrity between the dreams of childhood and the knowledge of what values are real that you will have on your deathbed on the other side of ego. And if you use a meditation like you just suggested, and you visualize the child self, you can ask the child what it wants you to do. And you can also visualize the child and the elder simultaneously, then just sit back and listen to them talk to each other. And they will express everything you need to live your life with integrity.
Right. I've got another variation on that might be interesting, particularly if you had difficulties with your parents. With your mom or dad, visualize them, and also maybe when they were young.
Yes. Ooh.
And give them a hug.
Love it. I hadn't thought about that. I love that.
It's not original to me.
That's multi-generational healing.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah. No, I didn't invent that. It's a meditation that people do in the Buddhist tradition, but also I do the one with my younger self. Every time I meditate, I give younger me a hug.
Yeah, I do that. I've never done that with my parents, though. And I'm going to do that within the next 24 hours. That's great. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's...
Last two, very quick, because these are quick ones. What are you reading now or watching?
I'm studying a time and energy management system. I'm not reading I'm reading the new Stephen King novel, Holly, and I'm studying a time and energy management system.
Okay, thank you.
On the plane from Seattle, which left at 7 in the morning, so we had to be up at 4 in the morning, and I didn't get to bed But nevertheless, from Seattle to Chicago, I read the essays in this, the Zen and the Art of Writing by Bradbury.
Okay.
And it was great.
Well, from Atlanta to Indianapolis, I read a story by one of the greatest living writers, a guy named Charles
Don't
Johnson.
Don't go there.
And
I sent him a story that I just finished 2-3 days ago.
That's right.
Because it's about martial arts. And I said, I got to show this to Steve. And you promised you'd read it on the plane, and you did, and I thank you for
Yes,
that.
I did.
Thank you.
I worked.
And one word, possibly one quick word,
Yes.
and we're going to bring Dr. Ackerman back up, but one quick word for any aspiring graphic novelists, writers. That was one of the questions, so I'm paraphrasing.
Okay, if you indulge me for just a second, I've got something specific I'd like to say. The 6-step process that we teach in life writing. And we learned this from Ray Bradbury and studying other people like this. The first step is write at least 1 sentence a day, every day. Just make that commitment. Second step is write between 1 and 4 short stories every month. The third step is finish those stories and submit them. The fourth step is do not rewrite your stories except to editorial request. Once you finish them, don't rewrite them, go on to the next story. The fifth step is you read 10 times as much as you write. And the last step is repeat this process 100 times. We teach this to our students, and not a single person who has followed this advice has failed to publish by story 26.
Okay, well, I used to teach at the University of Washington 33 years, and I give my students assignments. But one of the things I got them to do that I found extremely valuable is keep a writer's workbook. Do not let your day go by in which you have a thought, a perception, an image that comes to you, and you don't put it down in your writer's workbook. You see an article that you like, clip it. These are extremely valuable. I have writer's workbooks that cover 3 shelves and go back to the early 70s. They're like memory aids. Keep a writer's workbook. Blank pages, put anything you want to on it. You know, like just descriptive passages. You see somebody that you run into and they're dressed in a distinctive and interesting way. Oh, they got an interesting tattoo. That goes, the world is yours to process through perception, and you put these scraps, into your writer's workbook. And I assure you that they will be of use to you when you're, I go through my writer's workbooks, I've thought about and written something on every subject under the sun, literally since the early 70s. So it triggers my memory, and I see my younger self, actually, because what is it you're paying attention to in the 70s?
Yes.
Different than the 90s. And it's almost like an archaeology of your own consciousness, what you're focusing on during a particular decade. I just filled up one, and I was telling one of my friends here, I'd like to go by the bookstore to see if I can get another blank book, because I have to have that during the course of the day to put stuff into it.
That's my journal.
Is
Every
that-
day.
Yeah. I mean, writers have them. If you want great examples of what they look like, look at Hawthorne, look at Chekhov, look at Sartre. No, that's not Sartre I'm thinking of. Some of the great writers. We have their workbooks. They have plot outlines for stories they've never written. They have observations of people. Start a writer's, and just keep it. It's just for you, not for anybody else.
Okay. I'd like to make one quick comment. That if you like the way we've been talking about writing here, you might want to come to a screenwriting workshop that my wife and I are doing. You can find out about it at www.hollywoodloophole.com. And what I will say is ignore the price on there. If you need a price, we just want good people. We don't care if you can afford the full price. For people who we know, just write us a letter and saying that you need a break on the price. We'll take whatever you got. What we want is people to come on September 23rd and really want to learn how to write and about screenwriting. www.hollywoodloophole.com.
All right. And folks,
Great time.
please make sure you're going to the events for the Festival 451. Tomorrow at the Can Theater, we'll be screening Horror Noir with Tananarive Due. Wonderful. You have an opportunity for book signing in the back here. Dr. Johnson.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And there is an opportunity to get your books signed by Steve Barnes, Dr. Charles Johnson, Sharon Skeeter, and Tanina Reeve. There are 4 tables up here at the front. Please put on your note cards what you would like them to write in your book. To my left, the aisle in the far left, your right, we're going to line up over here. We're going to pull the tables forward, and we're going to get your book signed. If you need to purchase a book in order to have it signed, the book table is still up in the foyer to the back there where I'm pointing. And thank you all for a wonderful night. Thank you for such a stimulating discussion, and we love you. Thank you.